You're standing in a field of silence. The ground beneath your boots is uneven, scarred by trenches and shell craters. The air smells faintly of smoke, though decades have passed since the guns went quiet. This is France, World War I, a place where entire landscapes were swallowed by mud and blood. A place where millions of men fought, clawed, and died for just a few yards of earth. But now shift your vision forward 2 decades. Across the ocean. Across time. To the beaches of Normandy, the ruins of Stalingrad, the jungles of the Pacific. This is World War II, a war not of trenches, but of movement, fire, machines, and devastation on a scale the world had never seen before. The question is chilling. Whose battlefields claimed more lives? The endless mud of World War I France or the mechanized inferno of World War II America's front lines? Stay with me, because by the end of this journey you won't just know the numbers. You'll feel the difference between 2 wars that redefined humanity's relationship with death, sacrifice, and survival. And if you think you already know the answer, you might be surprised. War has a way of leaving scars. Not just on the bodies of men, but on the earth itself. Nowhere is that more visible than the battlefields of France during the First World War. When the war began in 1914, soldiers on both sides imagined a quick campaign parades, short victories, and a return home by Christmas. But France became something far darker. It became a graveyard stretched across an entire nation, the Western Front carved through northern France like a jagged wound. Trenches extended hundreds of miles, each one a miserable world of mud, rats, and despair. Soldiers huddled inside, waiting for orders, waiting for shells, waiting for death. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, the thunder of artillery shaking the earth, the whistle of a command, and then the rush over the top, young men climbing ladders into machine gun fire. Knowing that most would never return, the human cost was staggering. The Battle of the Somme alone, July 1916, claimed over 1 million casualties. In Verdun, the battle raged for nearly a year, devouring 300,000 lives. These weren't numbers. These were sons, brothers, husbands. Each casualty a story cut short in the mud of France. Yet what made World War I so haunting wasn't just the scale of death, it was the futility. Armies gained inches, sometimes feet, at the price of thousands of lives. Imagine fighting for months, only to stand on ground you could walk across in a matter of seconds. The land itself became cursed, churned into no man's land, where barbed wire and broken bodies lay twisted together, and still they kept fighting. France was the epicenter of this human tragedy. Towns vanished under bombardment, villages erased from maps, never rebuilt. The land was poisoned by chemicals, artillery shells still buried beneath the soil. Even today, farmers in northern France plow up rusted helmets, unexploded shells, and bones. The earth remembers, but here's the unsettling question. If France in World War I became a slaughterhouse of trench warfare, did World War II surpass it? When America joined the fight in 1941, would their battlefields prove deadlier, or had the world already endured its bloodiest nightmare? What happens when a nation untouched by war suddenly throws its entire weight into the greatest conflict in history? For 2 long years, the United States had watched World War II from across the Atlantic, sending weapons, food, and supplies to Britain while Europe burned. But on December 7, 1941, the illusion of distance shattered. The attack on Pearl Harbor pulled America into the global firestorm, and with it came a new kind of battlefield, one that stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, from the beaches of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes. The question is simple, but terrifying. Would America's battlefields in World War II claim more lives than the endless trenches of France in World War I? To answer that, we need to step into the boots of the soldiers who landed on foreign soil, carrying not just rifles, but the weight of a nation determined to end tyranny. When American troops first entered combat in North Africa in 1942, many were inexperienced. They had trained hard, but training could never prepare them for the brutal reality of facing seasoned German divisions. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, American forces were cut down, suffering heavy losses. The desert swallowed bodies, tanks burned under the sun, And the message was clear: this war would demand blood, and it would take it without mercy. But America learned quickly, within months, as U.S. forces hardened. They adapted, improved tactics, and began pushing the Axis back. North Africa fell, and with it came the invasion of Italy. The battles at Salerno, Anzio, and Monte Cassino were vicious, grinding campaigns where American soldiers found themselves not in trenches, but in mountains, villages, and ruins. Casualties mounted. Italy's hills became soaked with sacrifice. Yet still, these losses paled in comparison to what awaited across the English Channel, because on June 6, 1944, the United States would face one of the deadliest days in its military history. D-Day. Picture it. Thousands of ships stretching across the horizon. The roar of engines overhead. The steel ramps of landing craft crashing down, and young men stepping into a storm of bullets. Omaha Beach, the name alone, carries weight. Within hours, American soldiers were torn apart by machine guns, drowned by waves, or shredded by artillery. Nearly 2,000 Americans were killed in just that one morning. But somehow they kept moving forward, climbing cliffs, breaking defenses, and securing the beachhead. D-Day was not a single battle, it was the opening of a floodgate. After Normandy came the hedgerows, where every field became a fortress. The casualties mounted higher and higher. In the Battle of the Bulge, the last great German offensive in the West America suffered over 80,000 casualties in just 6 weeks. Frozen forests. Ambush in the snow. Entire units wiped out before reinforcements could arrive, and still, this was only one side of the war. Across the Pacific, a different kind of battlefield awaited. Imagine stepping onto an island jungle where every shadow hides an enemy determined to fight to the last breath. This was the reality of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Battles where Japanese defenders dug into caves, tunnels, and bunkers, forcing American soldiers and Marines to fight inch by inch. At Tarawa, in just 76 hours, nearly 1,000 Americans were killed and over 2,000 wounded. At Iwo Jima, 7,000 Americans would never return home. At Okinawa, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, over 12,000 Americans were killed. The fighting was so savage, so unrelenting, that it scarred the survivors for life. The Pacific battlefield was not mud and barbed wire like France, it was coral reefs, jungle heat, and the cries of men charging into machine gun fire across volcanic sand. Suicide attacks. Kamikaze planes plunging into ships. Flamethrowers clearing bunkers. These were battles where mercy rarely existed, and where the death toll climbed with merciless precision. So, how do these numbers compare? In World War I, the Western Front and France swallowed millions. But America's battles in World War II, though smaller in total numbers compared to the entire French front, were concentrated storms of violence. The difference was not just in how many died, it was in how they died. World War I's trenches were death by attrition. World War II's American battlefields were death by movement, by relentless assaults, by industrial firepower unleashed on human bodies. And perhaps the greatest horror came not from the battlefield itself, but from what ended it. Because while France bled over years of trench warfare, World War II ended with a weapon that turned entire cities into cemeteries in a single flash. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. America's ultimate battlefield was not in Europe or the Pacific, it was in the sky above, Japan, where 2 atomic bombs ended the war, but left a shadow of death that lingers to this day. So the question remains, if France was the graveyard of the First World War, and America's fronts were the inferno of the Second, which claimed more lives, which left the deeper scar on history's body? The answer is coming, but to understand it fully, we must step back. We must ask why these wars killed on such different scales, and what it meant for the men who fought, because next, we'll dive into the human side of sacrifice, the soldier's journey from fear to fate, and reveal how the experience of death in France's trenches compared to America's beaches and islands. What is more terrifying, knowing you will die slowly, suffocated in mud and poison gas, or knowing you might be torn apart in seconds by a storm of steel and fire? To answer that, we must step into the minds of the soldiers themselves. because numbers tell us how many died, but only their voices, carved into diaries, letters, and memories reveal what death truly meant on the battlefield. In the trenches of World War I France, life was a waiting game with death as the constant companion. The mud swallowed boots, swallowed rifles, and sometimes swallowed men whole. Soldiers lived among rats the size of cats, eating scraps, scratching lice from their skin, and praying for the shells to miss their trench by inches. Imagine sitting in darkness for days, hearing artillery rumble above, feeling the ground shake, and knowing that at any moment, a shell might bury you alive. The fear was not just of the enemy, it was of the environment itself. Waterlogged trenches collapsed, drowning men who had no time to scream. Poison gas drifted silently, searing lungs and eyes, leaving soldiers clawing at their throats as comrades tried in vain to fit masks over their faces. And even when the order came to attack, most soldiers knew what awaited them: machine guns that cut men down before they even reached the wire. Survival often felt like pure luck, not skill, but in World War II, for American soldiers, the battlefield was different. No endless trench lines, no static war. Instead, they faced a war of relentless movement, where death came not from waiting but from advancing. Every step forward was a gamble with fate. On D-Day's beaches, there was no time to prepare, no weeks of digging, and it was instant chaos. Men waded through water filled with bodies, bullets slicing the waves. The order was clear: move forward or die. In the Pacific, soldiers faced not mud and gas, but heat and exhaustion. The jungle was alive with hidden dangers: mosquitoes spreading malaria, swarms of flies feeding on corpses, snakes slithering in the dark. And then there were the human enemies: Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender, who would launch night raids with bayonets or hide in caves until American soldiers had no choice but to burn them out with flamethrowers. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing that somewhere in the dark, someone might crawl into your foxhole with a knife. Psychologically, the wars left different scars. In France, men described the horror of waiting under bombardment for hours, sometimes days, until their minds broke from the pressure. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was born in the trenches. Men shook uncontrollably, stammered, or went blind though their eyes worked fine. Their minds simply shut down after enduring the UNEND or ABLE. In World War II, American soldiers also suffered trauma, but it came from the intensity of battle after battle, never knowing when they would get a break. Many soldiers fought in multiple campaigns, from North Africa to Italy to France, or across island after island in the Pacific. Each new landing meant starting again, new comrades lost, new horrors faced. And unlike the mud-soaked waiting of World War I, the trauma here was often immediate and violent. One moment a friend was alive, the next he was gone, killed by a mortar, a sniper, or a hidden mine, and yet soldiers in both wars shared one haunting similarity: the realization that survival was often beyond their control. In the trenches, it depended on whether the shell fell short or long. On the beaches, it depended on whether the bullet found you or the man next to you. Death was random, arbitrary, and that randomness carved deep scars into those who survived. So which battlefield was worse? France's trenches, where men rotted in mud waiting for an attack they might not survive, or America's storm of steel in World War II, where men were forced to run straight into fire, knowing only speed and luck could save them? The truth is, there is no easy answer. For one soldier, the mud and rats were unbearable. For another, the storm of bullets was more terrifying. Both wars were hell, just different kinds. But here lies the greater question: why did the methods of killing change so drastically between these wars? Why did the world go from static lines of attrition to mobile infernos of destruction? And what did this shift mean for the number of lives claimed? Because the true comparison between World War I France and World War II, America, is not just about the soldiers' suffering, it's about the evolution of death itself. And to uncover that, we must turn to the machines of war. The guns, the tanks, the planes, and the bombs that transformed battlefields into killing fields. What is more terrifying, the slow, grinding death of millions by artillery shells and poison gas, Or the swift annihilation of entire cities by bombs that fell from the sky? To answer that, we need to trace how technology transformed the way wars were fought, and how it shaped the body count of World War I's France, compared to America's fronts in World War II, because behind every casualty was not just a soldier or a civilian, it was a machine, a weapon, a tool of destruction designed by human hands. In the First World War, France became a laboratory of industrial slaughter. The artillery gun was king. Over 70% of the casualties came from shells that screamed overhead and exploded with a thunder that shook the earth for miles. These guns could fire for days without pause. At Verdun, French soldiers endured weeks of non-stop bombardment, shells raining down at the rate of thousands per hour. The ground was churned into mud and blood, forests shredded into blackened stumps, villages erased entirely. The battlefield of France was not conquered by men but pulverized by machines. Then came the gas. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard chemical weapons that drifted silently across no man's land. Soldiers scrambled for masks, but many suffocated or coughed their lungs into bloody froth. Eyes burned. Skin blistered. Those who survived were often scarred for life, blinded or crippled. France's fields became haunted by this invisible killer, but World War II would take this mechanization and amplify it into something even more apocalyptic. When America entered the war, the battlefield had changed. The sky was no longer safe. Airplanes now carried death across oceans. Bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress or the B-29 Superfortress turned cities into rubble. Unlike World War I, where destruction was concentrated along trenches, World War II spread devastation across entire nations. From London to Tokyo, civilians became targets. The machines of war no longer killed just soldiers. They erased entire populations. Tanks also redefined battle. In World War I, tanks were lumbering, unreliable beasts, barely crawling over the mud of France. But in World War II, tanks became the spearhead of modern armies. America's Sherman tanks may not have been the most powerful, but they rolled across Europe in overwhelming numbers, supported by artillery, infantry, and air power. Warfare became mobile, fast, devastating. Battlefields shifted from stagnant lines to sweeping offensives that left trails of bodies in their wake, and then there were the ships. At Midway, America unleashed its aircraft carriers, changing naval combat forever. Planes sank ships before they ever saw one another. Thousands of sailors died in minutes, swallowed by the Pacific. Entire fleets went down without a single cannon fired in sight. But the most chilling leap in technology came at the very end. For while France had endured years of artillery, while American soldiers stormed beaches and islands under machine gun fire, the war ended with something entirely new: atomic fire. In August 1945, 2 bombs obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In seconds, tens of thousands were incinerated. Shadows of human beings were burned into walls. Survivors staggered through ruins, their skin hanging in strips, their voices silent from shock. One weapon had achieved in a moment what entire armies could not in years. So, did technology make World War II deadlier than World War I? In raw numbers, the First World War's French front saw more concentrated slaughter over longer years of grinding attrition. But World War II's machines of war allowed for bursts of death so sudden, so massive, that they dwarfed anything seen before. A single battle like Stalingrad consumed more lives than many entire campaigns of World War I, and a single bomb dropped by America ended more lives in one instant than entire months of trench warfare. What changed between the two wars was not just the scale of killing, it was the speed. Death in France came slowly, over months of shells and gas. Death in America's fronts came quickly, in waves of mechanized power. Both were horrific, but the pace of World War II's slaughter left the world reeling, yet beyond the machines lies a darker truth. Technology may explain how men died, but it does not explain why they kept dying. Why nations kept feeding sons into the fire, knowing what awaited them. Why commanders ordered attacks when they knew casualties would be catastrophic. And that leads us to the final question, the most haunting of all. Between France's mud and America's inferno, whose sacrifice truly weighed heavier on history's scale, and what legacy did their blood leave behind? So here is the question that has haunted us from the very beginning. Which battlefields claimed more lives? The mud-soaked killing fields of France in World War I, or the fire-scorched fronts where America fought in World War II? At first glance, the answer might seem straightforward. On the Western Front of World War I, especially in France, the death toll was astronomical. Millions of French, British, German, and Allied soldiers perished in trenches and no man's land. Verdun alone devoured 300,000 lives. The Somme consumed over 1 million casualties. Entire generations of young men were wiped out. France became a vast graveyard, its villages shattered, its fields poisoned, its families broken. No single American battlefield in World War II reached those same numbers of loss in one concentrated place. But America's fronts in World War II were different. They were scattered across the globe, stretching from Europe to the Pacific. Omaha Beach, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each one a separate inferno of death, each one leaving tens of thousands dead. The American toll in World War II was over 400,000 dead, less than the millions lost in France during World War I, yet the way they died carried a different kind of horror. They died in motion, not in stagnation. They died not in one long line of trenches, but in 1,000 different hells spread across continents. So whose battlefields claimed more lives? If we speak in raw numbers, France in World War I dwarfs America's toll in World War II. The scale of death in France was almost unimaginable. Every field, every town, every forest became part of the front. But numbers are only part of the story. America's battlefields in World War II redefined how lives were claimed. They showed the world that technology could kill faster, more efficiently, and more mercilessly than anything before. France's dead were the victims of attrition. America's dead were the victims of mechanized speed. France's war dragged soldiers into years of mud, rats, and gas. America's war hurled soldiers into days of beaches, forests, and islands where death struck like lightning. Yet behind all these comparisons lies the human truth. Whether in France or in America's battles, every single death was a world ended. A mother left childless. A wife widowed. A generation scarred. The land remembers, the families remember, and history remembers. And so the reckoning is this: France's battlefields claimed more lives in numbers. America's battlefields in World War II showed humanity how much faster those lives could be taken. Both were warnings etched in blood, lessons carved into the earth itself. But perhaps the real question isn't which war killed more. The real question is this: did we learn? Did we look at the rows of crosses in France, the burned-out cities of Europe, the shattered islands of the Pacific, and decide never again? Or are those lessons already fading, buried under new technologies and new ambitions? Because in the end, the numbers may tell us France claimed more lives. But World War II proved something even darker: that the ability to kill can always be perfected, refined, accelerated. And if we forget that, then history will not just repeat itself, it will surpass itself. So next time you hear the whisper of wind across a field in France, or stand before the endless headstones in Normandy, remember, the ground beneath you is not just soil. It is sacrifice. It is warning. It is history's way of asking the question we still struggle to answer.